For 11 weeks, the most powerful man in Brooklyn hadn't kept down a single bite of food. Marco Vitale was 37, ran the oldest family in the borough, and could open any door in New York with one phone call, but he couldn't hold down a spoonful of soup. 6 of the best doctors in the city examined him. Every test came back clean. Every one of them said the same thing. There's nothing wrong with this man. So he stopped trying. Night after night, he showed up at a rundown diner on 18th Avenue, sat at the far end of the counter in a coat worth more than the register, and ordered nothing but black coffee. Nobody in that place had the nerve to ask him why. Nobody except a 27-year-old waitress named Nora Quinn, who was working 2 shifts a day, buried under the hospital bills her mother left behind, raising her little sister alone, and had an eviction notice taped to her front door. She had every reason in the world to keep her head down and stay out of it. She walked over anyway, serving him a meal that would rewrite both of their fates. Against all odds, he ate, and for the first time in 11 weeks, the food stayed down. Neither of them knew it yet, but that simple act of humanity had just put a target on her back, because the true reason behind Marco Vitale's illness wasn't medical, and the only person who recognized the warning signs was the quiet waitress holding his empty plate. If stories about the quiet courage of ordinary people mean something to you, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs it tonight. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now let's go back to the night Nora Quinn carried that plate across the room. At 9 o'clock on Tuesday night, Nora Quinn counted the tips in the register for the second time because she'd counted them wrong the first time. $41. She left $5 in small bills in the drawer for the morning shift, folded the rest in half, and slipped it into the pocket of her apron, the one with the seam she'd mended herself with white thread because she couldn't find any black. In 3 years at the Blue Star, she'd come to know every crack in the Formica counter, and she knew exactly which 4th stool would creak if someone sat too far to the left. Her phone vibrated in the other pocket. She glanced at the screen, then turned it face down. Her landlord. It was the 3rd time he'd called that day, and she had nothing more to tell him than she'd had the first time. She wiped the counter again, even though it was already clean, and the phone vibrated once more, this time with a message from Maeve's 3rd-grade teacher. Maeve had left her crayon box in the classroom, and the teacher wanted to know whether Nora could find 15 minutes the following week to talk about the way the little girl often sat alone during recess. Nora typed that she would make time, deleted it, then typed exactly the same thing again and pressed send. She looked at the clock on the wall. There was still an hour and 20 minutes before closing. 3 customers remained in the diner. The 2 at the table near the window were sharing an order of fries and arguing about some game. The 3rd sat at the far end of the counter, close to the entrance to the kitchen, where, in Nora's experience, no one ever wanted to sit because the door struck the back of the stool every time someone passed through. He'd been sitting there for 3 nights. He didn't read anything, didn't look at his phone, didn't speak to anyone. He simply sat with his back straight and both hands resting on the counter, as though he were waiting for someone to come and sit across from him. Nora picked up the coffee pot and walked toward him, but before she could pour, Gus Petrakis leaned his head through the kitchen service window and called her name in the voice he used only when something in the kitchen was about to burn. She set the pot down and went inside. Gus was already standing there, the tongs still in his hand, and he closed the kitchen door behind her, something he had never once done in front of her during all his 30 years at that stove. He asked whether she knew who the man out there was. She said she didn't. Gus lowered his voice to almost a whisper and told her the man's name. Nora didn't react, because to her, it was nothing more than 2 syllables. Gus studied her for a moment, then explained that in this neighborhood there were families whose names people didn't mention over dinner, and that man was the head of the oldest of them all. He went on to say that his parents had once owned a diner in Bay Ridge before he came here, and there were things he'd seen often enough to know he never wanted to see them again. Then he gave her one final instruction, slowly, 1 word at a time. Pour the coffee, bring the check, say thank you, and beyond those 3 things, do nothing else. Don't ask questions. Don't stare. Don't let him remember her face. Nora nodded. She carried the coffee pot back out, filled the cups of the 2 customers at the window table, brought them their check, thanked them, and when they left, only 1 person remained in the diner. She stood at the opposite end of the counter, polishing glasses that had been dry for a long time, and looked over at him. In front of him sat his 4th cup of coffee that night. It was still full. The first 3 had been the same. She'd poured them down the sink herself, all 3 untouched, the coffee still reaching the exact line to which she'd filled them. He hadn't taken a single sip. She watched the way he sat, his shoulders resting against nothing, and realized she'd seen that posture somewhere before. Her mother used to sit that way at the dining table in their fourth-floor apartment, her back straight, her hands resting on the table, an untouched plate before her as she waited for her daughter to come home. During those final months, Nora had always taken extra shifts. She'd told herself that money was what her mother needed, and she'd traded money for all the evenings when she could have been sitting in the chair across from her. Nora set down the glass. She looked at the clock. 35 minutes remained. Then she went into the kitchen. Gus was scraping the griddle and didn't turn around. Nora lifted the lid from the cast-iron pot on the back burner, the one she'd left simmering since the beginning of the afternoon shift out of habit, something that wasn't on the menu posted on the wall, and that no one ever ordered. Beef stew. She'd learned to make it 3 years earlier from an elderly morning regular who had stood beside her in this very kitchen and shown her every step, insisting that it had to be bay leaf, not rosemary, and that the heat had to be lower than anyone would think. Nora ladled some onto a plate. Gus stopped scraping, turned around, looked at the plate, then at her, and said her name once more, this time without whispering. Nora didn't answer. She took a clean napkin and a spoon and arranged them neatly along the edge of the plate. Then she lifted it. She walked the full length of the counter, 14 steps, counting each one without understanding why she was counting. The man didn't look up. She set the plate down in front of him, placed the spoon on his right, then stepped back half a pace and stood still. He looked at the plate for about 3 seconds. Then, without raising his voice or looking at her, he said he hadn't ordered this. Nora said she knew. For the first time in 3 nights, he lifted his head and looked straight at her, and she saw dark circles beneath his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. He told her to take it away. Nora didn't move. He repeated himself in exactly the same even voice, saying that he'd told her to take it away. She said it wouldn't be added to his bill, and that she would take it away when he was finished eating. He asked whether she knew who he was. Nora said she did, that someone had told her about half an hour ago. He asked why she was still standing there. Then, she said it was because he'd been sitting on that stool for 3 nights and hadn't taken a single sip from any of the 4 cups of coffee she'd poured him that evening, and because no one left her section of the diner with an empty stomach. Only after the words were out did she hear how strange they sounded, but she didn't take them back. He said nothing more. In the kitchen, the sound of Gus scraping the griddle had stopped at some point, though she couldn't say when. Outside, traffic moved along the avenue in waves, and between those waves came a silence so thick that Nora could hear the old refrigerator behind her shudder as it rumbled back to life. The man looked at the plate. She looked through the window and saw, beneath the awning across the sidewalk, a man leaning against the fender of a black car, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the diner. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't talking on the phone. He wasn't doing anything except standing there and watching. He looked to be about 45, with broad shoulders, and he'd been there since before she carried the plate out. Nora turned back and saw that the man at the counter had picked up the spoon. He took a small spoonful, about half the size of an ordinary bite, and raised it to his mouth. He swallowed. Then he sat motionless for about 10 seconds, both hands resting on the counter, as if he were waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. He took a second spoonful, fuller this time. Nora didn't leave. She didn't say anything either. She stood about 3 feet from him, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the counter, and watched the food slowly disappear from the plate, the way people watched something they couldn't quite bring themselves to believe. He ate slowly and steadily, never pausing again. When he was about halfway through, she saw his shoulders lower slightly, so little that no one would have noticed unless they'd spent 3 nights watching him. He finished everything. Even the gravy was gone. He set the spoon down neatly in the exact place where she'd put it when she brought the plate out. Then he stared at the empty plate for longer than he needed to, and for one moment Nora thought he was about to say something. He didn't. He stood, took out his wallet, and laid a $100 bill on the counter. She opened her mouth to tell him the meal was free, but he had already turned away before the first sound could leave her lips. The bell above the door rang. The broad-shouldered man outside straightened, opened the rear door of the car, and after they were both inside, the car remained where it was for another half-minute before pulling away. During those 30 seconds, Nora had the unmistakable feeling that someone inside was watching her through the dark glass. Then the car was gone. Gus came out of the kitchen with a dish towel still in his hand and stood at the far end of the counter, looking first at the empty plate and then at the $100 bill. He asked whether she remembered what he'd just told her in the kitchen. Nora said she did. He asked what she thought she had just done then. She said she had just given a man his dinner. Gus threw the towel onto the counter. He said men like that didn't eat dinner in places like this. And if they did, it wasn't a good thing. It meant something. And things that meant something to men like him always ended with somebody paying the price. And the person who paid was never one of them. He went on to say that in 30 years of standing in that kitchen, he'd kept the diner peaceful by following one rule, and that was never to give anyone a reason to remember his face. Then he stopped, let out a breath, and his voice changed. He said he wasn't scolding her. He was just afraid. Nora said she knew. She picked up the $100 bill, folded it in half, and put it in the register instead of her apron pocket. Then she picked up the plate. It was spotless, so clean it almost didn't need washing, and she stood there holding it longer than necessary before carrying it to the sink. She turned on the water. Outside, the neon light above the sign flickered once, then came back on, just as it did every night. Inside the car, Enzo Barone waited until they were off the avenue before speaking, and the first thing he asked was who had given her permission to do that. Marco Vitali looked out the window and said no one had. Enzo asked whether he needed to have a word with the diner. Marco said no, and he said nothing else for the rest of the ride. The diner belonged to him. He had bought it 6 months earlier, paying twice the market value to a man who had been planning to close, because he could no longer compete with the coffee chain that had opened on the corner, and Marco had made only one demand in the contract, that the name on the sign and every member of the staff remain unchanged. The seller had signed immediately and hadn't asked why. No one at the diner knew, not even the head cook, because the purchase had passed through 3 layers of companies, and the name on the paperwork wasn't his. He had found the diner in the most foolish way possible. 3 months after his mother died, he opened a drawer in her room and found a stack of receipts, bound with a rubber band, arranged in chronological order, all from the same diner, all for small amounts, and tucked beside them was a matchbook printed with the diner's name, though she had never had any use for it because she didn't smoke. He counted more than 60 receipts. They stretched back over many years. All those years, he had believed his mother ate breakfast at home, and all those years, she had taken the bus down there alone, sat and eaten alone, then returned home without telling anyone. He couldn't remember the last time he had sat down and shared a meal with her. He remembered every time she had called and he hadn't answered, and he remembered that he had always called her back the next day and always said the same thing, that he was busy and would come by the following week. Lucia Vitali had been shot to death outside St. Bernadette Church on a Saturday morning 9 months earlier, as she was walking home after Mass, about 130 feet from where her driver had parked the car. No one had been arrested. For the next 7 weeks, Marco Vitali slept no more than 3 hours a night, and he went looking for answers in his own way. The name came to him from 3 different sources within the same month, and all 3 led back to the Rizzo family. 7 months earlier, he had collected that debt. He hadn't been there. He had simply spoken 1 sentence into the phone, exactly 7 words, then hung up, and that was the last time anyone ever heard the name Aldo Rizzo. He had believed he would be able to sleep after that night. He remembered sitting in his office, waiting for the feeling to come, the sense that the scales had finally been balanced, the feeling of a man who had just finished paying off a debt, and he waited all night, but it never came. The next morning, he rose to find that everything was exactly as it had been the day before, except that there was now another emptiness inside him, one that hadn't existed before, and instead of shrinking with each passing day, it grew. 3 months later, his body stopped keeping food down, and for the past 3 months, every night, he had told Enzo to drive down to the avenue. He never went inside right away. He sat in the car and stared at the sign for about 10 minutes before getting out. And he always chose the stool at the far end of the counter because the receipts listed table numbers, and the number that appeared most often was table 6. Table 6 stood in the opposite corner, and he didn't have the courage to sit there. Enzo hadn't asked why in 3 months, and that was why Enzo was still beside him. The following morning, Enzo entered the office carrying 2 rolls of printed paper and said the Falconieri family had moved 2 delivery points in Gravesend without permission or warning, that Staten Island had fallen behind on its payments for 3 consecutive weeks, and that 3 meetings had taken place that month, without Marco being invited. He spoke plainly. People could smell blood. Marco hadn't shown his face anywhere in 9 months, and in their world, a man disappearing from the table meant the same thing as a man disappearing from the face of the earth. Marco listened to everything without interrupting, then picked up the phone. He called a number, and when the person on the other end answered, Marco said he had 48 hours to return those 2 locations, and after 48 hours, there would be no one left to return them. Then he hung up, set the phone on the desk, and turned the screen face down. Enzo looked at him and said people would believe that for perhaps another month, no longer, because words carried weight only when the man speaking them was still standing firm, and Marco had lost 22 pounds. Marco didn't answer. He asked whether Enzo had looked into the woman from the night before. Enzo said he had. He read from the report. Her name was Nora Quinn. She had worked there for 3 years. She had no criminal record and no ties to anyone in the neighborhood. She had a younger sister whose legal guardian she was. Enzo asked whether Marco wanted him to deal with the matter. Marco looked at the report for a moment, then said no, leave it alone. That night, he told Enzo to drive down to the avenue as usual, and he didn't tell him that this time he wasn't planning to order coffee. For the next 3 nights, he didn't order coffee again. And for the next 3 nights, Nora served 3 plates, and all 3 came back to the kitchen spotless. No one in the diner said anything about it, not even Gus, who had taken to voicing his objections through silence, and by leaving the cast-iron pot ready on the back burner every evening without waiting for her to ask. By noon on Friday, the diner door opened while the lunch crowd was still thick, and the woman who entered looked about 34, her hair tied low at the nape of her neck. She walked straight past 4 occupied tables without glancing to either side. Nora was carrying a tray to table 2. The woman stopped in front of the counter, swept her eyes around the room as though searching for something, then looked directly at Nora and asked whether she was the one who had been feeding her husband. Nora set the tray down. Before she could answer, the woman reached out and swept the plate that had just come from the kitchen, the meal for the customer at table 2, onto the floor. It shattered. Every conversation in the diner died at once. Someone at the window table rose, then sat back down. The woman never looked at the broken pieces. She asked again, this time in a much lower voice, steady and almost polite, who had given Nora permission to do that. Nora said no one had. The woman asked whether Nora knew who she was speaking to. Nora said she could guess. The woman nodded as though she had just received the correct answer to a test, then said her name was Vivienne Vitali and explained that her husband was undergoing treatment, that a doctor monitored every meal he ate, and that everything he put into his mouth was part of a regimen she had spent months developing with the people treating him. She asked Nora what qualifications she had. Nora said none. She asked whether Nora knew how a sick man's body responded to greasy food. Nora said she didn't, that all she knew was that he had finished every bite for 3 nights in a row, and nothing had happened to him. Vivian was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said Nora didn't know that. She only knew the part she saw during the 4 hours he spent here, while the rest of the night unfolded in Vivian's home. She spoke those words very slowly. Someone in the diner began gathering their belongings to leave. Nora met her eyes and said that if Vivian wanted her to stop, she would stop, but only if he told her himself. Vivian smiled for the first time. She said that was precisely the problem, that people didn't wait for her husband to tell them. They simply needed to know their place. She went on to say that she had nothing against Nora, that she understood how someone in Nora's position might believe she was doing something kind, and that sometimes kindness caused more harm than cruelty, simply because the person offering it never stayed long enough to witness the consequences. Nora didn't step back. She said she had stood there for 3 years, and she would still be there tomorrow. At that exact moment, the bell above the door rang. Marco Vitali stood in the doorway, one hand still on the door, and behind him, Enzo stopped on the front step and didn't come inside. Marco looked at the shards of porcelain on the floor. He looked at his wife. Then he looked at Nora standing behind the counter with a dish towel draped over her shoulder. Everyone in the diner turned toward him. No one spoke for so long that Nora could hear the exhaust fan humming in the kitchen. Vivian turned around, and her voice changed completely, becoming softer and slightly weary, as she said she had merely happened to be passing by. Marco asked nothing. He didn't look at Nora a second time. He didn't say a word about the broken plate, about the question that had just been asked in front of more than a dozen people, or about the fact that his wife had stood in the middle of this diner and told a waitress that she needed to know her place. He simply stood there. Nora looked at him and waited, and then she realized that she was waiting. and she realized how absurd that was because he didn't owe her anything. Vivian walked toward her husband, raised a hand to rub her temple, and said she had suffered from a headache since morning and should go home. Marco gave a single nod. She walked out, and as she passed Nora, she tilted her head slightly without saying a word, and Nora would remember that small tilt of the head for a very long time afterward. The door closed behind her. Marco remained where he was for about 5 more seconds. Then he turned and left as well. He didn't sit on the stool at the end of the counter that day. Nora heard the car start and drive away. She walked around the counter, knelt, and picked up every shard of porcelain, dropping each one into a small bucket. A customer at the window table bent down to help, but Nora thanked him and said she could manage it herself. She apologized to the customer at table 2 and said a fresh meal would be ready in 10 minutes and there would be no charge. Gus didn't say anything. He simply stood at the kitchen service window, watching her gather the broken pieces, and by the time she rose to her feet, he had already turned back toward the kitchen. Only after the last customer from the lunch shift had left did Gus call her into the kitchen for the second time. This time, he didn't close the door. He took out 2 stools, set them down, sat on one, and pointed to the other. And Nora sat because in 3 years, he had never once asked her to sit down. He asked whether she knew who used to sit on that stool at the end of the counter. Nora said she didn't. Gus said there had been an elderly woman from the morning shift who had sat at table 6 for years, and she had known Nora better than she had known him because he was always in the kitchen while Nora was out there. Nora asked who he was talking about. Gus said her name, the first name she had always used whenever she sat down, and Nora nodded because she knew the woman, and she knew the woman had stopped coming almost a year ago, and she had once asked Gus about her, and he had said that elderly people often moved away to live with their children. Gus said he had lied to her that day. He said the woman was the mother of the man who sat at the end of the counter. He said she had been shot to death outside a church on a Saturday morning, and he had known about it that same week because he read the newspaper, because he recognized her full name in the report, and because he had stood alone in that kitchen and cried for about 10 minutes before coming back out to wipe down the counter as he did every day, without telling anyone. Nora said nothing. Gus went on slowly, saying that was why he was afraid. He said a gentle woman who walked to church every morning and had never harmed anyone had ended up lying on the ground simply because she carried that family name, and now her son had been sitting at the end of his counter for 3 straight months, and now there was another woman standing in the middle of his diner, throwing a plate onto the floor and demanding to know who had given Nora permission to feed her husband. He said he didn't care who was right or wrong in that family. He knew only one thing, that whatever happened inside families like that eventually spilled beyond their walls, and the person standing closest was always the one who got caught in it. He asked whether she had a younger sister. Nora said she did. Gus told her to think about that. He stood, put both stools away, and before turning back toward the kitchen, he added that he wouldn't have this conversation with her a 3rd time because he wasn't her father, because she was an adult, and because he had told her everything he knew. Nora couldn't think about anything else that afternoon. She finished her shift, picked Maeve up from the neighbor's apartment, cooked noodles for her, sat beside her at the table while she did her homework, then left her with the neighbor again and went back to the diner for the evening shift. She had decided she wouldn't serve another plate. She told herself that for the entire 3-block walk. At 9 o'clock, the black car pulled up across the sidewalk. Marco Vitali stepped inside, walked straight to the end of the counter, and sat down. Nora remained where she was, the coffee pot in her hand, and she didn't go to him. He didn't call for her either. About 5 minutes passed that way. Then he turned his head toward the window, toward the flickering neon sign outside, and narrowed his eyes. He stared at it for a long while. Then, without turning back, he asked whether the light there always had a yellow ring around it. Nora went still. The coffee pot tilted slightly in her hand, and 1 drop fell onto the counter. Her mother had asked that exact question at the dining table in their 4th-floor apartment about the light hanging overhead, and her voice had been just as calm then. Nora stood motionless. She didn't say anything. Marco turned to look at her, saw her staring at him, and raised 1 eyebrow as if to ask what was wrong. She shook her head, took a cloth, wiped the drop of coffee from the counter, and said old neon lights often did that. He nodded and asked nothing more. She went into the kitchen. The cast-iron pot was still on the back burner, still warm, and Gus was scraping the griddle without turning around. Nora stood in front of the pot for about half a minute. Then she lifted the lid, served a plate, took a napkin and a spoon, and carried it out to set before him. He looked at the plate, then at her. He didn't thank her, and she didn't wait for him to. He ate every bite. Before leaving, he placed money on the counter as he always did, and this time she said nothing about the bill. She simply put it in the register. After the car had driven away, Gus came out, looked at the empty plate, and didn't scold her. He said only that he hoped she knew what she was doing, then turned off the kitchen lights and went to get his coat. Nora washed the plate, placed it upside down on the rack, and on the walk home, she looked up at every streetlight she passed, all 9 of them, and not one had a yellow ring around it. Marco began keeping a record of his own. He didn't tell anyone, not even Enzo. He took a small notebook from his desk drawer, and every night he wrote down a single line, the date, where he had eaten, and whether he had kept the food down. After 11 days, he read it over, and the pattern emerged so clearly that he had to read it a second time. On the nights he ate at the diner, he came home late and didn't touch the dinner that had been prepared for him, and on those nights, he slept. On the nights he came home early and sat down at his own dining table, everything came back up within an hour. He read it a third time, and he thought of what anyone would have thought, then pushed the idea aside because there was no place for such a thought in his mind. He told himself that at the diner, he ate when he was hungry, while at home, he ate when he was tired. He tore out the page and fed it into the shredder, but he kept recording. Vivienne knew he had been going to the diner before he even suspected she knew. She said nothing about it. Instead, on Monday morning, a middle-aged man in a white apron was standing in the Vitali kitchen when Marco came downstairs, and Vivienne introduced him as a private chef, explaining that she had spent 3 weeks finding someone with experience, caring for patients with digestive disorders. That same week, a nurse began coming 3 times a week to measure his weight and blood pressure and record the amount of food he consumed in ounces. By Thursday, Dr. Grant Ellison came to the house. He was 56 years old and had been the family physician since Marco's father was alive. And he sat in the study for 40 minutes explaining an anti-nausea regimen involving 3 medications taken at fixed times, along with a printed list of things Marco was to avoid entirely. At the top of that list was food prepared elsewhere when its source was unknown, and its ingredients couldn't be controlled. Ellison said he had seen many patients sabotage their own treatment over a meal they enjoyed, and that those very meals were what prolonged the illness rather than cured it. Vivienne sat beside him without speaking throughout the entire visit, taking notes. At the end, she asked Marco only one question, whether he intended to cooperate, and Marco said he did. From that day forward, the Vitali kitchen was locked after 9 o'clock at night. The chef prepared every meal and recorded every ingredient in a notebook kept on the counter, and that notebook was always open, always visible, and available for anyone to inspect at any time. The nurse weighed Marco at 7 o'clock every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning, and entered the result on a form with a space for a signature. Vivienne made only one additional request, that no food from outside be brought into the house, and she said it in front of both the chef and Ellison. Ellison nodded in agreement, and everything was entered into the medical record. No one raised their voice. No one threatened anyone. Everything bore a signature. By the second week, on the other side of the city, a man carrying a briefcase walked into the Blue Star at 10 o'clock in the morning and said he had come to inspect the compliance records at the owner's request. Gus asked which owner. The man produced a document bearing the name of a management company Gus had never heard of, and Gus couldn't argue because he was only the head cook. The man stayed for 4 hours. He photographed the refrigerator thermometers, demanded to see every employee's food safety certificate, recorded the hours each person had worked over the previous 6 months, and asked in exacting detail whether the kitchen ever prepared anything that wasn't listed on the posted menu. Gus said it didn't. The man wrote that answer on a form, asked Gus to sign beneath it, then put it away. Before leaving, he said there would be another inspection within 30 days, and that everything would need to be standardized before then. Nora stood polishing glasses at the far end of the counter and heard every word. After the man left, Gus dropped heavily onto a stool in the kitchen and said nothing for 15 minutes. That same week, Enzo received a new schedule. It arrived by email from the administrative department, stating that the change was intended to optimize travel routes and reduce the risk of repeatedly following the same path, and it eliminated every evening route that passed along the avenue. Enzo printed it, carried it into the study, placed it on the desk in front of Marco, and said that in 19 years of service, he had never once received a schedule from the administrative department. Marco read the page. He said nothing for a long while. Then he said they were still going that night. Enzo said that if they went, someone would know. Marco said then let them know. At 9 o'clock that night, Nora was putting away the chairs when she heard the bell above the door. He came in, sat at the end of the counter, and before she could make her way into the kitchen, he spoke the first words he had willingly addressed to her since that first night. He asked what time she closed. Nora said 10:30. He nodded and said nothing more, and she went into the kitchen to serve his plate as she did every night. When she set it down, he asked what the dish was called. She said it didn't have a name. People just called it beef stew. He asked whether it was on the menu. She said no. He looked at the plate, then asked why she made it. Nora said because one pot lasted for several meals, because she liked the way it made the kitchen smell at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and because if it was left in the pot, it tasted even better the next day. He said those were 3 reasons, and none of them answered his question. She said then she didn't have an answer. He finished the entire plate, and when he stood up, he said good night, and it was the first time he had ever said those words. 3 days later, in the middle of the afternoon, a woman nearing 60 pushed open the door and stepped inside. She stood in the entrance for several seconds, looking through the front window before approaching the counter. She asked for something to take with her. Nora handed her a menu. The woman didn't look at it. She asked whether they served beef stew. Nora said it wasn't listed there. The woman said she knew. They looked at each other for about 3 seconds. Then the woman gave her name, Rosa Ferraro, and said she had worked as a housekeeper for a family in Bay Ridge for 22 years, though she didn't name the family. Nora didn't ask. She filled a container, closed the lid, and placed it in a paper bag. Rosa paid in cash, counting out the exact change, and when Nora handed her the bag, the woman gripped its handles tightly and whispered that if anyone asked, she had never been there. Then she walked toward the door, and before opening it, she stopped and looked out at the sidewalk one more time, checking both directions before stepping outside. She returned the following Tuesday, then Friday, then twice a week without fail, always in the middle of the afternoon, always paying cash, always looking through the front window before entering. On the 4th visit, Nora did something without thinking much about it beforehand. She tore a scrap of paper from the receipt pad and wrote that it had to be bay leaves, not rosemary, and that the heat should be lower than anyone would think. Then she folded the note and taped it to the bottom of the container. She didn't sign her name. Rosa said nothing about the note on her next visit, nor on the one after that. But the 6th time, when Nora handed her the bag, Rosa took it and said he had even eaten all of it cold. Then she left at once, as though afraid she might say another word. Nora kept writing, never more than 2 lines. Once, she wrote that when reheating it, they should add a spoonful of water, not oil. Another time, she wrote that this batch tasted best after sitting overnight. Once, she wrote only one word, hot, because she had served it just after turning off the stove. On Thursday night, he came into the diner later than usual. Only Nora remained out front, with Gus in the kitchen. He sat down, and Nora brought him a plate, and when she started to turn away, he asked whether anyone helped her in the kitchen. She said there was a head cook. He asked how long she had worked there. She said 3 years. He nodded. Then he said someone in his house had been buying food there and taking it home. Nora stood still and neither confirmed nor denied it. He went on to say that the woman hid the bag in the bottom drawer of the second refrigerator in the garage, that she thought he didn't know, and that he wasn't going to say anything to her. Nora asked why he was telling her. He was silent for several seconds, then said he wasn't sure. He said he hadn't spoken to anyone in 9 months, except to say the things that had to be said. And he had realized it the night before last when he sat in his car and couldn't think of a single person to call. Nora stood behind the counter, still holding the dish towel, and she didn't know how to answer, so she asked whether he wanted more bread. He said yes. She went to get it. By the time she returned, he had eaten half the plate, and he thanked her for the bread, and neither of them said anything else until he stood to leave. Before walking out, he stopped and told her she should lock the door as soon as he was gone. Nora asked whether something was wrong. He said nothing was wrong. It was simply late. Then he left. She locked the door. She stood behind the glass and watched the car pull away, then went back inside to wash his plate. And she thought of the woman who stood outside the diner, looking both ways, before she dared to enter, and she thought that 22 years was a very long time to work in a house. One was still so deeply afraid of. The 11th container was the one Rosa forgot. She had been called upstairs just after slipping the bag into the bottom drawer of the second refrigerator in the garage. And she went up without having time to remove the note taped beneath the container as she always did. The next morning, Vivienne went out to the garage for a case of mineral water and opened the wrong refrigerator door. She didn't call Rosa downstairs. She took out the container, lifted it, turned it over, peeled away the piece of tape, unfolded the note, and read it. There were 2 handwritten lines saying that when reheating the stew, she should add a spoonful of water instead of oil, and that it would taste better after sitting overnight. She read it twice. Then she folded the note along its original creases, slipped it into her pocket, returned the container to exactly where it had been, closed the refrigerator door, and went back into the house. She said nothing to Rosa that day. She said nothing to her husband either. At 10:40 that night, Nora had just turned the sign to closed and was stacking the chairs on the tables when someone knocked on the glass. She looked up. Vivienne Vitale was standing outside alone, with no car parked in front of the diner. Nora unlocked the door. Vivienne stepped inside, walked past her, chose the nearest table, pulled a chair down, and sat. She asked whether Gus had gone home. Nora said he had. Vivienne nodded, then took the note from her pocket, unfolded it, smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, and placed it on the table, turning it so Nora could see the writing. She asked whether Nora recognized the handwriting. Nora said she did. Vivienne said she appreciated that Nora hadn't wasted time denying it. Then she took out her phone, opened a screenshot, and began to read. She read the balance still owed to a hospital in Brooklyn, down to the last dollar, the name of the collection agency handling the account, and the date they intended to move it into the next stage. She read the name of the public school 7 blocks from the diner, the name of the 3rd-grade teacher, and said that tuition might be free, but the after-school program wasn't, and that payment was 2 months overdue. Then she read the address of the 4th-floor apartment, the housing court case number, and the date the notice the landlord had posted on the door would expire. She read every one of those things in the same voice someone might use to read a grocery list. Then she put her phone away and sat in silence. Nora remained standing, one hand resting on the back of a chair. She said nothing. Vivienne said she wasn't telling her these things to frighten her. She was telling her so she would understand that Vivienne wasn't guessing. Then she said that her husband owned the diner. Nora didn't react, and Vivienne watched her for a moment before saying that she could see Nora truly hadn't known. She said he had bought it 6 months earlier through an intermediary company, that the name on Nora's employment contract now belonged to him, and that because of that, she could have Nora fired right now, tonight, with a single phone call the following morning. She said she wasn't going to do that. Nora asked why. Vivienne said people shouted when they had lost control, and she never shouted. She said that if she fired Nora now, her husband would ask why, and then he would have a reason to come back there, and she had no intention of giving him one. She said she preferred her own way. Then she delivered her final words. She said Nora wouldn't be fired, no one would come knocking at her door, and no one would say anything cruel to her. She would simply find that everything became harder, little by little, and eventually, she would walk away from the diner on her own, believing it had been her decision. Nora said she had heard her. Vivienne stood, pushed the chair back into its exact place, and said she would leave the note for Nora to keep. She walked toward the door. Before stepping outside, she stopped and added one more thing. Nora shouldn't think Vivienne hated her, because Vivienne didn't even think about her long enough to manage that. Then the door closed. Nora remained where she was for about a minute. Then she walked to the table, picked up the note, folded it, and tucked it into her apron pocket, the one with the seam mended in white thread. She finished stacking the remaining chairs. She turned off the lights above the counter, locked the door, and walked the 3 blocks home. Along the way, she didn't think about the debt, the court case, or the diner. She thought of only one thing, that the woman who had just left knew everything about her without ever once asking her a single question. 9 days later, a woman in a gray coat arrived at the diner at 10 o'clock in the morning, introduced herself as the regional manager for the operating company, and said she would be stopping by every Tuesday for the next 6 weeks. She sat at the table near the door with a laptop for 4 hours. Before leaving, she handed Gus a newly printed work schedule, along with a page explaining that customer traffic data from the previous 6 months showed the diner had been scheduling too many employees between 9 o'clock at night and closing time. On that schedule, Nora's evening shifts had been cut from 5 nights a week to 2. 3 other employees had also been affected, each losing 1 shift. Gus called the phone number printed at the bottom of the page, and the person who answered read him the exact same explanation. No one mentioned Nora's name. No one had done anything wrong. 4 days later, when she brought Maeve home from the neighbor's apartment, she found a note tucked into the door, asking her to contact a caseworker with New York City Children's Services regarding an anonymous complaint the agency had received. Nora called back that same evening. The appointment was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. The caseworker arrived on time. She was a young woman with glasses who asked permission before stepping through the door. And she said at the very beginning that most complaints like this led nowhere, but the required procedures still had to be followed. She looked around the apartment for about 10 minutes, asked Maeve what grade she was in, and Maeve said 3rd grade. Then she asked what subject Maeve liked best, and Maeve said science because the class had planted beans in paper cups the week before. Then the child returned to the table to finish her math homework, because she had only 3 questions left. The caseworker asked Nora several questions about her work schedule, childcare arrangements, and meals, then wrote down the neighbor's name and phone number. She stayed for a total of 25 minutes. Before leaving, she said she would note in the file that no problems had been found and that the closing letter would arrive in about 2 weeks. Then, as an aside, she added that anyone could file an anonymous complaint. Some people did it out of genuine concern, while others did it for different reasons, and the agency had no way to tell the difference, so every complaint still had to be investigated. Nora thanked her and closed the door. She went back inside, sat beside Maeve, and helped her finish the last 3 questions. Maeve asked who the woman was. Nora said she worked for the city and visited homes with children to make sure everything was all right. Maeve asked whether their home was all right. Nora said it was. The child nodded and returned to her math. The closing letter arrived 11 days later, just as promised, and it stated that the case had been closed. Nora taped it to the refrigerator. 6 days after that, the notice from Housing Court arrived. The landlord had filed for an expedited hearing, and the court date had been set for 3 weeks later, instead of following the usual process, which could take months. Nora called him. He didn't avoid her. He answered immediately and said he was very sorry, that he had already given her more time on 4 separate occasions, and that this time he needed to bring the matter to an end because someone had offered to buy the entire building and wanted it delivered with the apartments vacant. She asked who the buyer was. He said he didn't know because the transaction was being handled through a company. She asked whether anyone had pressured him. He said no, that they had offered a good price and that was all, and that if he were in her position, he would ask the same question, but there truly wasn't anything more to it. Then he wished her luck and hung up. Nora sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in her hand, and she counted them again. A work schedule based on data. An anonymous complaint the agency was required to investigate. A landlord selling his building to a buyer offering a good price. 3 things, in 3 different places, involving 3 different people, and not one of those people had said a single unkind word to her. There was nothing in any of the 3 situations that she could take to someone and say, "Here, this is wrong." She thought of what the woman had told her at the table near the door, that she would walk away on her own and believe it had been her decision. She stood, went into the kitchen, opened the cupboard, and began making dinner for herself and her sister because it was time. Maeve sat at the table, her legs swinging without touching the floor, and asked what they were having that night. Nora said noodles. The child said good. Tuesday was one of the 2 nights when she still had an evening shift, and he arrived at nearly 10 o'clock. The diner was empty. Gus had gone home at 9:30 because the new work schedule had cut his hours too. Nora served the food, set the plate down, and this time she didn't return to the far end of the counter. She stayed where she was, leaning against the edge, about 2 steps away from him. He ate half the plate, then set down his spoon and asked whether she was tired. She said she was fine. He said she didn't look fine. She said then that made them even. He gave a very short laugh, the first laugh she had ever heard from him, then fell silent for a moment and said there had been a woman who used to sit in this diner many times, and he had never known. Nora didn't ask who. He said she had taken the bus down there alone, while he had always assumed she ate breakfast at home. He said he discovered it 3 months after she died, from a stack of receipts bound with a rubber band in a drawer. He said that for years she had called him, and he had always told her he would come by the following week. Nora asked whether he ever did. He said yes, sometimes. Then he corrected himself and said no, hardly ever. He said the worst part wasn't that she was gone, but that he couldn't remember the last meal they had shared, and that he had spent the past 9 months trying to remember and still couldn't. Nora stood quietly for a moment, then said she knew what that felt like. He looked at her. She said her mother had died 2 years earlier. He asked why. She said heart failure, something that had gone on for years, nothing sudden. She said her mother had taken a heart medication called digoxin for a few years, and it was an old, inexpensive, effective drug, but it had one danger every doctor had to warn patients about again and again. The difference between a dose that worked and a dose that became toxic was very narrow. He asked how narrow. She said narrow enough that if the kidneys weakened even slightly, or if the patient took another medication that didn't interact well with it, or ate poorly for a few weeks, the level in the blood could rise on its own even though no one had changed the dose. He asked how she knew so much about it. She said because it had happened to her mother once. He asked what happened. She said her mother started feeling nauseated, then began vomiting almost everything she ate. It lasted for more than 2 weeks. She went to the doctor twice, and both times she was given medication for the nausea and told to go home and rest. Nora said her mother lost weight, grew exhausted, and no longer wanted to eat, while Nora kept believing she was simply becoming weaker because of her heart disease, and that was what Nora believed for those entire 2 weeks. He asked what happened next. She said that one evening, her mother was sitting at the dining table and asked her a question. He asked what question. Nora didn't answer immediately. She said her mother had asked whether the lamp hanging above the table had always had a yellow ring around it. He said nothing. Nora said she had answered no, that the lamp looked normal. Then she said she took her mother to the emergency room that night, and the staff asked what medications she was taking, and as soon as they heard that name, they ordered a blood test. The results came back in less than an hour. The level in her blood was more than twice the safe limit. He asked what they did. She said they stopped the medication, monitored her heart rhythm, and within 3 days, she was eating again. She said the doctor that night had told her something she still remembered, that if the patient hadn't mentioned seeing the yellow halo, they might have sent her home again, because vomiting, fatigue, and loss of appetite could point to hundreds of different things, while that yellow halo pointed almost exclusively to one. He sat in silence. Nora said her mother lived for nearly 2 more years after that. He asked what those 2 years had been like. She said she worked a great deal. Then she added only one sentence, that she had traded her evenings for money, and she said nothing more about it. He nodded slowly. Then Nora asked him a question, and she asked it in the most ordinary voice she could manage. She asked whether, the other day, when he had looked at the sign outside and asked her about the yellow halo, he had truly seen it, or whether he had only been making conversation. He said he had truly seen it. He said he didn't see it all the time, only during the past few weeks, and only around neon lights and streetlights, and he had assumed it was eye strain from not sleeping. Nora asked whether he was taking any heart medication. He said no. She asked again whether he had ever been prescribed any, even once, even many years ago. He said never. He said his heart was normal. He had undergone an echocardiogram and an electrocardiogram twice in the past 3 months, and everything had come back clean. Nora said nothing. She picked up the dishcloth, wiped a spot on the counter that was already clean, then set it down. He asked what was wrong. She said nothing. He watched her for several more seconds, then finished the rest of his meal. When he stood to leave, she wished him good night, and he said the same to her, and the door closed, and Nora stood alone in the empty diner with one hand still resting on the counter, and she didn't move for a length of time she would later be unable to remember. Nora didn't sleep that night. She lay awake thinking about what she would say to him on Friday evening, rehearsing 3 different openings in her mind, and all 3 led to the same place. She would have to tell him that someone in his house was putting something into his food, and how many people were there in that house, and who decided everything that was served at that dining table. She thought about what would happen if she said those words and he didn't believe her. She would have used the only chance she had, and she would never get another one. Near dawn, she changed her mind. On Thursday afternoon, she walked 2 blocks to the covered parking garage on the corner, where the black car waited at that same hour every day, and she stood at the entrance until she saw the broad-shouldered man step outside. She called his name. Enzo Barone stopped, looked her up and down, and asked what she wanted. Nora said she needed 5 minutes to speak with him. He said she had 2. She told him that the man he drove for was seeing yellow halos around lights. Enzo showed no reaction. She went on, saying that the condition had a name, that it was a classic sign of poisoning from a certain heart medication, and that it came with nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, and weight loss, the very things he was watching every day. She said Marco wasn't taking any heart medication, had never been prescribed any, and she had asked him herself. Enzo asked who she was to know such things. She said her mother had gone through exactly the same thing, and she had sat in the emergency room while the doctor explained it from beginning to end. Enzo was silent for about 5 seconds. Then he said she was telling him that someone inside that house was doing this. Nora said she wasn't naming anyone. She was only telling him what she had seen. Enzo stepped closer and lowered his voice. He said he had been in that house for 19 years, that he knew every person who came and went, and that what she had just described was the kind of thing people watched on television at midnight, not something that happened in real life. He said he understood. She worked in a diner. She saw a man who could eat at her place but couldn't eat anywhere else, and she had put those two things together and invented a story of her own. He said 6 doctors had examined Marco. 6. Not one of them had found anything. He asked who she thought she was to believe she knew better than all 6 of them. Nora said she didn't know better than anyone, and none of those 6 doctors had tested for a medication their patient wasn't taking because they had no reason to test for it. Enzo told her she should go home. She remained where she was. He told her a second time that she needed to leave, right now, and that if he ever saw her near that parking garage again, things would be different. Nora turned away. After walking a few steps, she stopped and told him that if he didn't believe her, that was fine. He only needed to look inside the medicine cabinet in that house once. If there was nothing there, then she was wrong, and she would never seek him out again. Then she left. Enzo stood at the entrance to the garage for another minute or so. He didn't call anyone. That evening, he drove Marco home, waited until the lights upstairs had gone out, then circled around and entered through the side door. The house was silent. He went up to the 2nd floor, walked down the hallway, and stopped outside the medical supply room, whose door had always been left slightly ajar since the nurse began coming. He pushed it open. Inside was a small wall-mounted cabinet with 2 unlocked drawers. He opened the first one. There were 3 boxes of medication from Marco's prescribed regimen, each label bearing the name of the pharmacy, the patient, the date of the prescription, and a signature. He picked them up one at a time, read each label, then returned every box to its exact place. Then he rested his hand on the 2nd drawer. He stood that way for about 10 seconds. He thought about what he would say if someone walked past the room at that moment and asked what he was doing. He thought about the fact that he was standing in the home of the man he had followed for 19 years, searching a cabinet behind that man's wife's back, and he thought that if he opened the drawer and found nothing inside, he would still be the man who had opened it. He drew his hand away. He left the room exactly as he had found it, with the door slightly ajar, then went downstairs and left the house through the side entrance. In the car, he sat for a long time before starting the engine. He didn't call Vivienne. He didn't say anything to Marco the following morning either, or on any morning after that. Upstairs in the bedroom, Marco lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the small notebook in the drawer and the lines he had written inside it. He thought about the suspicion he had pushed aside 2 weeks earlier, and he realized that this time it refused to leave. Vivienne chose Monday morning, after the nurse had finished weighing him and left. She knocked on the study door, waited until he told her to come in, then entered and sat in the chair across from him, without saying anything for a while. Then she said there was something she needed to tell him, something she had been considering for 2 weeks. She said Rosa had come to her and told her that the waitress at the diner down the avenue had asked her several questions. Marco asked what questions. Vivienne said the woman had asked whose name the house was in, whether he had any brothers or sisters, and who would inherit everything if something happened to him. She said Rosa had been too frightened to tell him directly, and that she herself had intended to remain silent. But then she had found something else. She placed a printed sheet of paper on the desk. It was a statement from a personal account at a bank, with a branch 4 blocks from the diner. There was exactly one transaction worth noticing: a transfer of $20,000 deposited the previous Friday, and the name of the account holder was Nora Quinn. Marco picked up the paper. He asked where she had gotten it. Vivienne said the family's legal department still conducted routine checks on the names of people who appeared around him, that the procedure had been in place since his father's time, and that he could ask them about it himself whenever he wished. She said she wasn't drawing any conclusions. She said she was only giving him the paper. Then she stood and left the room, closing the door very softly behind her. Marco sat with that paper for nearly an hour. Then he called the family attorney and requested an independent verification without involving the legal department or anyone in the house. The answer came back the following afternoon. The money was real. It had entered that account on that exact date. The source of the transfer passed through 3 layers of intermediaries, and the trail ended at a shell company registered in Delaware. The attorney told him that going any further would require a court subpoena and several months. Marco asked whether there had been any activity in the account since then. The man said no. The balance remained untouched. Not a single dollar had been withdrawn. Marco put down the phone. He thought that the money might still be there because she hadn't dared spend it yet, or because she was waiting, and neither interpretation favored her. Nora learned about the money on Tuesday morning when she went to the bank to ask about an overdraft penalty. The teller looked at the screen, then at her, and said her account had a positive balance, before asking whether she wanted to see the statement. Nora stared at the number on the screen for so long that the teller had to ask her again. She asked where the money had come from. The teller said the system showed only the transfer code of a company, with no sender's name. Nora asked whether she could return it. The teller said there was no receiving account to send it back to, and that if she didn't want to use the money, she should leave it untouched and file a dispute over its source, though the process would take several weeks. Nora filed the dispute. She took the receipt home, placed it in a drawer, and didn't withdraw a single cent, even when she counted the money in her wallet that evening and realized it wasn't enough to last the week. He came on Thursday night. She heard the car before she heard the doorbell, and by the time he walked inside, she already knew something was wrong because he didn't go to the far end of the counter. He stopped in the middle of the diner. He placed the statement, folded in half, on the nearest table and told her to read it. Nora looked at it. She said she already knew, that she had discovered it on Tuesday and had filed a dispute with the bank over the source of the money. He asked where the receipt was. She said it was at home. He said of course it was. She said she would bring it in the very next day. He said she could take as much time as she wanted to bring in whatever papers she liked. Then he asked whether she had questioned Rosa Ferraro about the house and about who would inherit what. Nora said no. He asked whether she had ever asked Rosa anything about his family. Nora paused. She said yes. She had once asked Rosa how long she had worked there. He said then the answer was yes. She said that wasn't what he had just asked. He said he could no longer tell the difference. Then he spoke his next words in an even voice, not a fraction louder than usual. He said she was fired as of that day. Nora asked what right he had. He said it was his money and his diner. She stood motionless. He said he had bought the place 6 months earlier, that he had kept the sign and every member of the staff, and that the company named on her employment contract belonged to him. Nora looked around the diner where she had stood for 3 years, and for about 3 seconds, she understood a great many things all at once. She said nothing more. She removed her apron, folded it, placed it on the counter, took the scrap of paper from the pocket with the seam mended in white thread, and slipped it into her coat pocket. Then she walked to the door. At the threshold, she stopped and said his dinner was still in the pot and that it tasted best after sitting overnight. Then she left. 3 days later, the housing court ruled that the landlord could repossess the apartment, and Nora was given 14 days to move out. Rosa called on Wednesday afternoon the following week. She didn't give her name. She only said something had happened and Nora had to come, then read out an address in Bay Ridge and told her to use the back way, through the wooden gate beside the garbage cans. Don't ring the bell. Don't stand out front. Nora left Maeve with the neighbor and took the bus. Rosa was already waiting at the gate. She opened it just wide enough for one person to slip through, then locked it again immediately. She led Nora across the backyard, into a narrow passage connecting the garage to the kitchen, and stopped before a door left open, no more than the width of a hand. She raised a finger to her lips. There were 3 voices inside. The first belonged to Vivian. The second was that of an older man, slow and deliberate, pausing now and then to turn a page, and Nora guessed he was the doctor because he mentioned weight readings and several blood pressure figures. The third voice belonged to another man, younger and faster in his speech, Vivian's brother, Julian Costa. The doctor was saying he had finished preparing the evaluation. He read several passages aloud, stating that the patient had lost 24 pounds in 4 months, that he showed signs of impaired visual perception, that he had repeatedly refused to follow the treatment plan and had eaten unregulated food from outside without permission, and that there were signs of declining judgment, affecting his ability to make decisions concerning his own health. Vivian asked whether he would sign it. The doctor was silent for a while, then said he had treated that family for 30 years and had never signed anything like this. Vivian said he had never received a payment like this either. Then she told him she wasn't asking him to lie, that every number in the document was real and had been measured by him personally, and that all he had to do was write the conclusion. There was the sound of a pen. Julian said that settled the difficult part. He went on to say that the healthcare power of attorney had been in place for years, that Marco had signed it 7 years earlier along with a pile of other documents, that it had been only one sheet in a stack of 40, and he had signed without reading it, and that the person designated in it was his wife. He said that once they had the attending physician's evaluation, the document would take effect automatically. No court, no one's consent, no requirement to notify anyone. Vivian asked how long it would take. Julian said the facility in Connecticut would admit him within 48 hours if the file was complete. It was a private facility with a secure treatment unit, no telephones in the rooms, and all outside contact had to go through the healthcare agent. He said Marco would receive excellent care and wouldn't be able to go anywhere. Vivian asked when. Julian said 6 o'clock Friday morning. He said the car would arrive before daylight had fully broken, that he had arranged for Enzo Barone to go down to Philadelphia on Thursday afternoon for a matter that would keep him there overnight, and that by the time Enzo returned, everything would be over. Then he spoke about the rest of it. He said the property power of attorney was more complicated, but he already had someone preparing it, and once Marco was inside the facility, everything else would become easier. Within 6 months, everything in Marco's name would be transferred into a new management structure. There was the sound of a chair being pushed back. The doctor said he wanted to make one thing perfectly clear. He was signing only the evaluation, and beyond that, he knew nothing and wanted to know nothing. Julian laughed. He said that was what everyone involved in the matter said. Then he told the doctor not to worry because the heaviest part had been taken care of 9 months earlier, and this was only the final cleanup. The doctor asked what he meant by that. A brief silence followed. Then Vivian spoke her brother's name in a low, cutting voice. Only once. And Julian said, "All right, enough." But he continued anyway, speaking with the irritated tone of a man who resented being interrupted. He told the doctor to think about it. The old woman had attended Mass at exactly that hour for years. Everyone knew it, and that was all it took. He said the difficult part hadn't been what happened outside the church. The difficult part had been making sure her son never looked in their direction. He said no one could refuse to believe 3 separate sources appearing within the same month, and that they had spent 7 weeks planting those 3 pieces of information, every one of them pointing to the same name. Then he said that name, Aldo Rizzo. He said the old man had nothing to do with Marco's mother, nothing to do with any of it, and that was precisely why they had chosen him. Rosa pulled her out of the hallway before the chair inside the room shifted a second time, pushed her across the backyard, opened the gate, and before locking it again, she managed to say only one thing. She didn't dare listen to any more, and Nora must never call that number. Nora stood on the sidewalk for about a minute, with both hands gripping the strap of her bag, then started walking toward the bus stop and went 2 blocks past it before she realized what she had done. She reached home at nearly 9 o'clock, picked up Maeve, fed her, sat beside her while the girl colored a map of the states, and when Maeve was asleep, Nora sat at the kitchen table and spent the entire night thinking about what she actually had in her hands. She had one afternoon spent standing outside a half-open door. She hadn't seen anyone's face. She had no photographs, no recording, and no full name for the man who spoke so quickly, only his first name. The only person who could confirm any of it was a housekeeper who had begged her never to call again. By morning, Nora still hadn't found any way better than the worst one, which was to find Marco and tell him. She waited at the end of the street leading to his office building from 10 o'clock Wednesday morning. The black car returned at nearly 1 in the afternoon. Enzo got out first, saw her, and stepped forward to block the walkway before she could approach. Marco was already out of the car. He looked at her without the slightest sign of surprise, and that was even worse. Nora said she needed 3 minutes. He said she had 1, and he remained exactly where he was without coming any closer. She told him that a car would arrive at his house at 6 o'clock Friday morning. She said a medical evaluation had been signed, stating that he was no longer capable of making his own healthcare decisions, and that a document he had signed 7 years earlier would automatically take effect once that evaluation existed. She said he would be taken to a private facility in Connecticut to a secure unit with no telephone in the rooms. She said Enzo would be sent to Philadelphia on Thursday afternoon, so he wouldn't be there. Marco listened to everything without interrupting her once. Then he asked where she had heard those things. She said she had stood outside a door in his house. He asked who had let her in. She said she couldn't reveal that person's name. He asked whether she had seen anyone inside the room. She said no. He asked whether she had the evaluation in her possession, or a photograph of it, or any document at all. She said no. He nodded slowly and said that what she had, then, was a story. Nora said she might be wrong about many things, but she remembered the date and time exactly, and there was only one thing he had to do. He mustn't be in that house on Friday morning. Marco was silent for several seconds. Then he said he would tell her what he saw. He said he saw a woman who had just lost her job and her home, who was holding money she claimed not to know the source of, and who had now brought him a story without a single piece of paper to support it. It was a story that, if he believed it, would require him to turn his back on his wife, his family doctor, and everyone else in his house, leaving her as the only person still standing beside him. Nora said she didn't need him to believe her. She only needed him not to be there on Friday morning. He said that was the same thing. Then he spoke his final words. He told her never to come back. He turned away and didn't stop once as he walked into the building. Enzo raised one hand toward the car and said he would drive her home. Nora said she could take the bus. He told her to get into the car. She did. For 15 minutes, neither of them spoke. He drove more slowly than necessary. Near the entrance to her street, he pulled over without turning off the engine, then turned to look at her. He watched her longer than anyone needed to say goodbye, long enough that Nora had to ask whether something was wrong. He didn't answer. He merely reached over and unlocked the door on her side, and after she got out, he remained sitting in the car for a while before driving away. That evening, Nora packed. She put their clothes into 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box, took Maeve's drawings off the refrigerator door, and pressed them between 2 sheets of cardboard. She still had 11 days, but she wanted to do a little at a time so everything wouldn't pile up at the end. Maeve had been asleep since 9:30. At nearly 11 o'clock, Nora sat on the edge of the bed with a list of people who might let them stay, and she had already crossed out 2 of the 4 names. At 11:40, her phone vibrated. The number was unfamiliar. Nora answered. Rosa's voice was very soft, barely more than a breath, and there was wind in the background, as though she were standing outside in the yard. She said they had moved up the schedule. She said the car would arrive tomorrow morning. Nora asked what time. Rosa said they'd told her before 6 o'clock, maybe earlier. Then she hung up. Nora called back. The phone was off. She sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 5 seconds, then stood. She knocked on her neighbor's door close to midnight and said she had to leave on an urgent matter. The woman didn't ask what it was. She simply opened the door and told her to bring the little girl over. Nora carried the sleeping Maeve into the neighbor's living room, tucked a blanket around her, and left the key to her apartment. She counted the money in her wallet, $14 and some change. She looked at the drawer containing the bank receipt, but she didn't open it. She walked to the subway station. The night train arrived 19 minutes later. She changed lines once, waited another 26 minutes on an underground platform, and while she waited, she called Marco. The phone rang. No one answered. She called a second time. It rang until the call ended again. The third time, it went straight to voicemail, and she didn't know whether he'd turned off his phone or blocked her number. She left a 15-second message, then realized no one was going to listen to it. By the time she reached the last stop on the line, it was after 2 o'clock. From there, she still had to take a bus down to Bay Ridge. She stood at the bus stop for 40 minutes. At that hour, the night bus came only once every half hour. She sent Marco 3 text messages, each one a single line, stating the time, stating that a car would arrive before 6 o'clock, stating that she didn't need him to answer, only to get out of the house. There was no read receipt. The bus arrived. She sat in the front row and watched the clock on her phone more than she watched the streets outside. And every time they stopped at a red light, she calculated the remaining distance all over again. Near 4 o'clock in the morning, she got off at a corner about 7 blocks from the house because she didn't dare go any closer. She stood beneath the awning of a closed store, looked through the contacts on her phone, and saw that she had only 1 number left. She had saved it the day he drove her home. He had recited the number and told her to save it without explaining why, and she had done so without asking why. She called. It rang, then stopped. She called a second time. Nothing. a third time, a fourth. On the fifth call, she let it ring until the end. The moment it stopped, she called a sixth time, then a seventh. On the eighth call, there was a click, then the sound of breathing, then Enzo Barone's hoarse, irritated voice, asking whether she knew what time it was. Nora said the car would arrive at Marco's house before 6 o'clock this morning, not tomorrow. Enzo said he was in Philadelphia, and he wasn't discussing this over the phone. Nora said he was in Philadelphia because someone wanted him there. Enzo fell silent. Then he said she'd already told Marco all of this, and Marco had already given her his answer, and that he had nothing more to add. He said he was going to hang up. Nora spoke quickly. She said there was one more thing, and she would tell him in 30 seconds. If he still wanted to hang up after those 30 seconds, she would never call him again. He didn't hang up. She said that afternoon she had stood outside a door in that house and heard 3 people talking, and one of them was Vivian's older brother, a man named Julian. She said he had spoken about how the old woman had attended Mass at exactly the same hour for so many years, and how everyone knew it. She said he had explained that the difficult part wasn't what happened outside the church. The difficult part was making sure the sun never looked in their direction. She said he had told them it took 7 weeks to plant 3 separate stories in the same month, and every one of those stories pointed to the same name. Then she said the name, Aldo Rizzo. She said Julian had added one more thing, that the old man had nothing to do with Marco's mother at all, and that was exactly why they had chosen him. Then she went silent. There was no sound at the other end of the line. No breathing, no movement, nothing at all. Nora looked at the clock. 10 seconds passed, then 20. She pulled the phone away from her ear to see whether the call was still connected. It was, and she pressed it to her ear again. A little past the 30-second mark, she heard a very small sound, like car keys striking against one another. Then his voice returned. It was no longer hoarse. It was no longer irritated, and it said 4 words. Where are you now? Nora gave him the name of the intersection. He told her to stay exactly where she was, then hung up. She stood beneath the awning of the closed store for 1 hour and 40 minutes, and during that time she called Marco 4 more times, but no one answered any of them. Enzo's car arrived at 5:55. He didn't say a word when she got in. He drove 7 blocks in less than 2 minutes, and when he turned onto the road leading to the house, a white private ambulance was already parked close to the gate, its lights off and its rear doors open. The clock on the dashboard read 6:10. Vivian stood on the front steps with a hard-backed folder in her hands. Beside her were 2 transport attendants in blue uniforms, while Dr. Ellison stood 1 step behind them with his hands in his coat pockets. The front door was open. Marco came out alone, with no one helping him, and after 3 steps, he had to reach for one of the porch columns to steady himself. Enzo braked sharply in the middle of the driveway. Nora was out of the car before he was. Vivian turned toward them, and for half a second, her face failed to hold its shape before settling back into place. She said Marco needed rest in a professional care environment, that she had tried to discuss this with him more times than she could count. She raised the folder and said everything had been done according to proper procedure. There was an evaluation from his attending physician. There was a healthcare power of attorney he had signed himself 7 years earlier, and if he wanted to read it, she would hand it to him right then, 1 page at a time. Marco still had one hand pressed against the column. He looked at the folder. Then he said he hadn't asked whether the papers were valid. He said he was asking whether any of it was true. Vivian didn't answer. Dr. Ellison lowered his eyes to the ground. Marco turned to the 2 men in blue and said no one was being taken anywhere that day, and they should leave. The man standing nearest the ambulance doors looked at Vivian, then at Ellison, and when Ellison said nothing, he closed the rear doors and both attendants got into the vehicle. The white ambulance backed out through the gate and drove away. Vivian remained on the steps with the folder still in her hands. Marco didn't look at her. He looked at Nora and asked how she had gotten there. She said she had taken the subway and then a bus. He asked when she had left. She said midnight. He was quiet for a moment, then asked what she wanted. Nora said she wanted 30 minutes in the kitchen. She said that after those 30 minutes, he could think whatever he wanted about her. Rosa opened the kitchen door for her without saying a word. The refrigerator held everything she needed, because the private chef shopped 3 times a week. Nora found the bay leaves in the second row of the spice drawer. She worked faster than usual, kept the heat lower than anyone would have expected, and didn't speak to anyone the entire time. Marco sat at the dining table in the next room. Vivian remained in the living room and didn't go anywhere. Ellison stood on the porch, took out his phone as if to call someone, then put it away without making the call. 30 minutes later, Nora carried the plate out and set it before Marco, along with a spoon placed on the right. He ate. He finished every bite. Then he sat motionless for 10 minutes with both hands resting on the table, and nothing happened. That was when Rosa Ferraro came in. She emerged from the kitchen hallway, her hands trembling visibly, and placed a small amber plastic bottle on the dining table. The label bore the name of a medication and the name of a patient, and that patient wasn't anyone who lived in the house. She said she had found it 2 weeks earlier in a locked kitchen cabinet drawer, one with its own key, and that she had taken it to her room and kept it hidden in her apron pocket ever since, because she didn't know whom to give it to, and she was afraid. She apologized twice in a row. Marco picked up the bottle and read the label. He said nothing. He called Enzo inside, handed him the bottle, and told him to take him to a hospital, but not one that appeared on any list belonging to the family. Enzo drove straight across the bridge into Manhattan, to a general hospital with no connection to anyone they knew. In the emergency room, Nora did the talking. She handed the bottle to the physician on duty and named the active ingredient. She said the patient had been vomiting for months, losing weight, suffering from a lack of appetite, and in recent weeks had begun seeing yellow halos around sources of light. The doctor asked what heart medication the patient was taking. Marco said he wasn't taking any and had never been prescribed one. The doctor stopped writing, looked up at him, then ordered the blood tests. The results came back 50 minutes later. The level in his blood was more than twice the safe limit. The doctor said a reading like that couldn't simply appear in someone who had never been prescribed the medication. He added, almost as though speaking to himself, that this was the sort of thing doctors found only when someone thought to look for it, because no one tested for a medication the patient wasn't supposed to be taking. Marco sat on the edge of the hospital bed with a bandage still covering the place where they had drawn his blood, and he stared at the test results for a long time. Then, without looking up, he told Enzo to call the lawyer and then call the police, in that order. Enzo waited until they had both left the emergency room and were sitting in the car in the parking garage. Then he left the engine off. He said there was something he had to tell Marco now, because if he waited until tomorrow, he would never say it. He said that 9 months earlier, 3 separate pieces of information about Aldo Rizzo had reached Marco, and one of those 3 had come from him. Marco didn't turn his head. Enzo said his son, 24 years old, owed a debt he couldn't repay, and the man holding that note had come to see him in the 2nd month after the old woman died. That man's name was Julian Costa. He said they hadn't forced him to do anything. They had simply given him a name and told him to mention it exactly once, at exactly the right moment, and he had done it. He said he hadn't known who was responsible for the old woman's death until that afternoon, when this young woman called him. He said he had stood in front of the medicine cabinet on the 2nd floor and hadn't dared open the 2nd drawer, and for the next 2 weeks, he had thought about it every night. Then he placed the car keys on the dashboard and sat perfectly still. Marco stared through the windshield for a very long time. Then he said he had killed one man because he believed another man's word. He said he wouldn't kill anyone else for that reason again. He told Enzo to pick up the keys and drive. When they reached home and everyone else had gone, leaving only Marco and Nora sitting in the kitchen, Marco asked her where she had learned that recipe. She said she had learned it from a regular who came during the morning shift, a woman who always sat at table 6, gave only her first name, and never said anything else about herself. Nora said the woman had stood beside her in the kitchen and shown her every step, and she had insisted that it had to be bay leaves, not rosemary, and that the heat had to be lower than most people would think. Then Nora said the woman had added one more sentence that day, something Nora hadn't understood for 3 years. Marco asked what she had said. Nora told him the woman had said that if her son ever walked into that place, Nora should feed him, because he often forgot to eat whenever he was angry. Marco said nothing. He sat there for a very long time, with both hands resting on the table, in the exact posture of a man waiting for someone to come and sit across from him. Nora didn't say another word, and neither of them turned on the lights as the kitchen slowly darkened around them. 3 weeks later, Vivienne Vitali, Julian Costa, and Dr. Grant Ellison were arrested. The medicine bottle, the laboratory results, Rosa Ferraro's statement, and Marco's complete medical records were handed over to the prosecutor. Ellison was the first to testify in exchange for leniency, and his testimony opened the way to everything else. While Aldo Rizzo's death remained a complex open investigation due to the lack of direct physical evidence, the truth was finally documented in federal records. Marco Vitale understood that this wasn't forgiveness. He pleaded guilty in federal court for the Eastern District of New York to financial crimes, cooperated fully in the investigation of the Costa family, and received a sentence of 26 months. 4 days before reporting to prison, he signed the Blue Star over to Nora Quinn, with no conditions attached, and he asked only one thing, that she keep the sign exactly as it was. The $20,000 was recovered by the bank as evidence, and Nora never touched a single cent of it. She paid off every debt with the diner itself, slowly, 1 month at a time, over more than 2 years. It is now an October afternoon, and Maeve Quinn is 10 years old, sitting at the last table near the kitchen, doing her homework with a glass of milk beside her. Gus Petrakis is still in the kitchen, still scraping the grill at that exact hour. Table 6 remains empty, as it does every day, and a small vase of flowers sits upon it, something no one is ever allowed to remove. The bell above the door rings. Nora looks up. A man walks in without saying a word, goes straight to the far end of the counter, and sits down on the old stool. She enters the kitchen, lifts the lid from the cast iron pot on the back burner, serves a plate, takes a clean napkin and a spoon, then walks the full length of the counter and sets everything down in front of him. He picks up the spoon. This story leaves us with something very simple. A human being's deepest hunger isn't the hunger for food, but the hunger for a pair of eyes that still sees them as a person, not as a medical chart, a title, or a fortune. 6 of the finest doctors in the city failed to find the truth because they looked only at the numbers. A waitress found it because she looked at the human being. And there is one more truth. Revenge has never given anyone back what they lost. It only makes them lose again. And sometimes it costs the life of an innocent person. Kindness doesn't require a title, a degree, or money. It requires only one person willing to stop and notice the person beside them. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can continue listening to more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And has there ever been a stranger in your life who stopped for you? Or have you ever been the one who stopped for someone else? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.